Traffic and Parking Commission. Welcome, everyone. If you are not satisfied with a decision made by the Traffic and Parking Commission, you may appeal the decision by filing for a writ of certiorari with the Davidson County Chancery or Circuit Court. Your appeal must be filed within 60 days of the date of the entry of the Commission's decision. We advise that you seek your own independent legal advice to ensure that your appeal is filed in a timely manner and that all procedural requirements have been met. I seek approval of today's agenda. We have a first. Is there a second? Second. First and a second. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes of last month's meeting? Is there a motion to approve the minutes? So moved. We have a first. Is there a second? Second. We have a first and a second. All in favor? Aye. The minutes have been approved. Approval of the consent agenda. Please note that items on the consent agenda will be voted on at a single time. No individual public hearing will be held, nor will the commission debate these items unless a member of the audience or the commission requests that the item be removed from the consent agenda. Before we read it, does anyone have any questions, concerns with the consent agenda as presented? Chip, do you have any?
Well, I guess what you're asking is, does anybody need to pull anything from
Yes.
consent? I do not.
Okay. Okay. All right. So we're going to read the consent agenda and ask for approval.
Mr. Chair, can you
Yes.
Can you cover the technical issues we're having?
Yes, okay. Just as an FYI, we have two technical issues. One, I left my bifocals at home, so I may have a hard time reading. And a more important technical issue is apparently our computer technology may not be working. We may have to share screens, and we're not getting any projection
Right.
above.
We apologize. I don't know if there's a TV feed, and I know there's not an audience feed, so that side of the monitors are working, this side is not. So if you're presenting something and you need to see the screen, we've got a chair sitting over there for you to come up to.
Okay.
Just have to wing it today.
All right. I think we can work through those. I just hope I can work through my own difficulties. So, all right. The consent agenda, 1903 resolution, the mandatory referral, item A, CD for Council District 18, 2019M008AB001, a request for the abandonment of right-of-way for alley number 952 from 16th Avenue South westward to alley number 970, and for alley number 970 from Belmar Avenue northward to alley number 952. Request by Catalyst Design Group applicant, Belmont Real Estate Holdings LLC owner. Item 2019M010AB001, a request for the abandonment of a portion of unimproved right-of-way between parcels 06513013400 and 06513000300 along Bighorn Drive from Lebanon Pike northward. Easement rights to be retained, requested by Reagan Smith Associates, applicant for Hermitage Rentals. Request 2019M009AB001, a request for the abandonment of alley number 1144 right-of-way and easement from Trevor Street south to alley number 935, requested by Darwin Shane Teeters, applicant and owner. Parking regulations, a request to modify the parking on Capers Avenue at 19th Avenue South to residential permit parking Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. with 1 hour non-permit parking requested by Council Member Sledge. Is he here today? Okay. Modified parking on 12th Avenue North as follows: no parking anytime on the west side from Grundy Street to Church Street, and no parking from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. on the east side from Grundy Street to Church Street, requested by Council Member O'Connell and resident. Modified parking from no parking anytime on the north side of Grundy Street from 12th Avenue North to Church Street, requested by Council Member O'Connell and resident. Item G, modified parking on the west side of 6th Avenue North between Union and Church Street from no parking anytime to no parking from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 4 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday, requested by Metro Public Works. Traffic regulations, item H, authorized stop sign at Robinwood Avenue and Argyle Avenue, requested by Councilmember Davis. Item I, authorize always stops at the intersection of Coalwood and Sneed, Coalwood and Wallace, and Coalwood and Lindenwood, requested by Councilmember Henderson. Item J, authorize stop signs intersection of Clover Nook and Tulip Hill Drive, Clover Nook and Hickory Dale Drive, Clover Nook and Linwood Drive, and Clover Nook and Gain Drive, requested by Metro Public Works. K, authorize a stop signal at Batavia Street and 27th Avenue North, requested by a resident. Stop sign. Authorize a stop sign at Booker Street and 22nd Court North, requested by a resident. Item M, authorize stop sign at 22nd Avenue North and Herman Street, requested by a resident. That is the consent agenda as read. Is there a motion to approve?
Can I make a comment?
Yes.
On item B, I have some questions about that. Evidently, that property used to belong to Hermitage Rentals, so I got my questions answered on it, and I'm okay with it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions, comments from fellow commissioners? Is there a motion to approve?
Move to approve.
We have a first. Is there a second? First and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The consent agenda has been approved as read. Thank you. Okay. The next item on our agenda is parking modernization. We have Mr. Kelsey from the mayor's office.
We did have one item that was deferred from last month's meeting.
Oh, okay.
If you
Thank
would
you.
like to
Oh,
discuss
deferred
that.
business. Thank you for
Yes.
keeping me straight. Deferred item, request for a valet zone at 154 2nd Avenue North, requested by Vaseline Company. Is there comments?
Okay. At last month's meeting, there was concern over the fact that we were eliminating a parking space to provide for a valet space. It is only one parking meter space that we will be eliminating, and the concept is for every one parking space, due to the valet code, they can move a vehicle every 10 minutes. So that will allow traffic flow of 6 vehicles during an hour if we remove that one metered space and make it a valet zone.
Okay. I think there have been some comments at the last meeting. Okay. Based on that, is there a motion to approve or comments?
Well, was that the one we had talked about postponing because of all that was going on? Is that my memory correct? That just because there was so much happening on 2nd Avenue and we didn't understand holistically how valet was being handled and how many other valet spots there were on 2nd?
That was not included in the discussion. There was a gentleman here at last month's meeting that I remember had an
that was
opinion on it,
Yeah,
so
so
therefore.
that was a different one. Okay.
My recollection wasn't this a kind of a space by itself that wasn't connected to others?
It is a space by itself, and if we eliminate the one parking space, that will increase the size of the other valet zone that is already operating there at that location.
Okay, that's what my recollection is. It somehow, it was kind of a stray or orphan space, and it would be consistent with the rest of the
That is
operational
correct.
use on the street. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Can you remind me what the hours of operation are for that?
Based on the application that they've submitted, it will be 24/7.
All right. Further questions, concerns about this? Is there-
Representative from Vaseline is here if you would like to speak with him.
So it's attached to it's expanding an existing valet spot?
There is already one valet zone 50 feet from here.
Okay.
So therefore, we remove that one parking meter, we increase the size of the current valet, and allow it to serve another business.
Is it the same company operating in both spaces?
No.
Not at this time, no.
There's a musician's loading zone. Is it between that existing, it's between the existing valet and the one that's being proposed where how is that going to be impacted?
Okay, there is a crosswalk, a fire hydrant, and then the one parking space.
You know, Corby's pulling it up on your monitors here any second
Oh.
now. It is that straggler parking
It's
spot.
that one parking meter.
And we talked about it last month. So we've talked in the past about removing the 1 meter spot because it's kind of just standing out there by itself. And then we had an application for a valet in the same area, so we were going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Now, I see your concern about having a valet right there as much as having a parking space right there. Is that it, Corby? I can't.
But based on the current use of that one parking space, there is a vehicle that sits there on a regular basis after hours. And also, we have support from the police department recommending approval of that valet to help improve the traffic flow in that area.
Okay, is there a motion to approve or disapprove?
So moved to approve.
We have a motion to approve. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a first and a second on approval. Okay. All in favor of approval, you'd raise your hand. Okay. Any opposed? Okay. It's been approved. Thank you. All right. Are there any other stray items to handle before we move to our action item of parking modernization? So, Mr. Kelsey, thank you for coming in today. If you would introduce yourself and your guest, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Great, thank you, Chair. My name is Brian Kelsey. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer in Mayor Briley's office. If you will recall, the last time I was here was in September, where I briefed you on an effort to modernize Metro's on-street parking and curb management approach, and promised that I would be back when we were ready to talk about policy changes and a way forward. So that day has come. On behalf of the mayor, thank you very much for your time and attention to this matter. We're looking forward to having a robust discussion today about what it is we're recommending. To my left here, these are 2 of the consultants who we've been working with on this effort over the past 18 months, give or take. To my immediate left here is Dan Kim, who works at Loop Capital and has been kind of the lead on a lot of the financial analysis. And to Dan's left is Skip Stitt with Faegre Baker Daniels Consulting out of Washington, D.C. Skip is going to handle the bulk of the comments today, and he'll tell you a little bit about his experience doing something similar to this in Indianapolis, and some other experience he's had that's been really valuable and helping guide us through this effort here. Before I say anything else, I want to thank both Terry Costonis, Chip and Diane, and other members of Public Works, and Keith Durbin back here. And I think that's it for the internal working group. There's been an enormous amount of time and effort spent over the last 18 months looking at best practices, researching approaches to this, going through an elaborate procurement process that is not over yet. I mean, it's been hours and hours of work. So I just wanted to say thank you for your dedication in doing that. I know it's been a heavy lift, and the mayor appreciates it. Why are we here? Just to revisit a couple of things I said in September when I was here. Nashville is trailing a lot of what other cities have done in terms of a modern approach to on-street metered parking. But I think, as you'll see in this presentation, this is about a lot more than just meters. It's really about putting Nashville on a path to being a true 21st century smart city. The benefits for undertaking this project and making the policy changes that are going to enable this modernization are going to be far-reaching. It's going to be about more than just parking. And so, this is an initiative that we're really excited to bring to you today, and I look forward to the presentation and having a conversation with you all this afternoon. And I think at this point, I want to turn it over to Skip. For members of the audience, I did bring hard copies. I think I brought about 30 hard copies of the presentation, along with the cover memo from the mayor on this. So if you're in the audience, since the equipment's not working and would like a copy, I think we have some over here. So Skip, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Brian. Members of the commission, thank you for letting Dan and me be here today. I'll give a quick background on myself, then I'm going to let Dan introduce himself, and then we'll dig into the presentation that's in front of you. As Brian said, my name is Skip Stitt. I am a lawyer by training, but now work as a consultant at Faegre Baker Daniels in Washington, D.C. I work inside of a public consulting group that works with cities, counties, states, and authorities across the country on public management issues, primarily focused on infrastructure. And we do a lot of work in the parking space, both on-street parking, structured parking, and service parking that is owned and managed by cities. In addition, I have been a public official. In a prior life, I was a deputy mayor and chief operating officer for the city of Indianapolis. So I have a pretty good understanding of general public management issues. Obviously don't know Nashville as well as you all do, but do have a pretty strong grasp of public sector issues and how they work. And I'll let Dan introduce himself, and then we'll dig into this short presentation.
Thanks, Skip. My name is, again, Dan Kim. I work at Loop Capital in New York. I've been doing this for about 17 years. I run the transportation group in my firm that runs the gamut of all the assets that are out there: airports, parking, toll roads, et cetera. And my background has wholly been in public finance / tax-exempt bond underwriting.
Thank you, Dan. So we'll start on page 2 of the presentation. And as Brian said, what we're talking about here with parking modernization is something that is being routinely done in leading cities around the world. And parking management is more than just parking spaces. It has to do with urban planning, what's now called curb space management, and other smart city strategies. One of our key areas of focus will be on providing this commission with an extraordinarily robust set of data to help inform your parking and parking management decisions going forward. In looking at your system, it doesn't have all of the leading features, leading customer service features we see in the most well-run parking management systems around the country. The system requires multiple handoffs among parties, and this is not unique. This is where everybody starts. You've got a lot of folks who touch your parking and your ticketing and your enforcement process, and the system doesn't provide the type of real-time data that we would typically expect to see in the most well-run systems. Again, not a critique there. It's just that in really well-run systems, you have access to data that shows you parking utilization by space in enormous detail, right? Where do you have too much parking? Where do you have too little parking? Where are you filling spaces? Where are you not filling spaces, and why? And we think this modernization is going to provide you with really an extraordinary asset to use as you do planning in the city in the future. On slide 3, we've got some principles that are outlined here, and these are principles that Metro Nashville provided to us. We agree with these principles, and we think they've been a helpful foundation as we embarked on this modernization analysis. Importantly, we think Metro and the Traffic and Parking Commission should continue to control policies related to parking. While you may use a partner to do some of the administrative tasks, issues about policy should reside with you as representatives of the public sector. We also think that you ought to seek to create value for community, whether it is improved service, enhanced data and analytics, or financial improvements by innovation and operational excellence, right? We're not fans of using rates as a way to create significant value. We think you ought to do it with technology and innovation, and those have been our marching orders from Metro since the beginning. We're going to talk about a long-term agreement here because we think that's a way to create significant value, but we've got to be able to accommodate your needs in the future. So the agreement has to be very flexible because transportation is changing. It wasn't that long ago when when parking was all about a single space meter fed by coins. That's not the world we're in now. But parking and curb space management are changing dramatically, right? We've got scooters now, we've got Uber and Lyft, and we're going to have autonomous vehicles in increasingly large numbers in the future, and that is going to dramatically impact how we use and how we manage parking, particularly in urban centers. And we think that any agreement we structure has got to be flexible enough to accommodate those policy changes that you're going to want to make in the future. Customer service is going to be first and foremost in our mind, and we want to make sure that we accommodate people who want to get to commercial areas, whether they be restaurants or retail, and that should be a central focus of our efforts. As I mentioned, we've got to make sure we anticipate this evolution with autonomous vehicles. I don't know when that's going to occur, but lots of folks have an opinion on that. But we do believe that in the coming decades, we're going to see a dramatic increase in autonomous vehicles, and that will have an impact on parking, right? Parking will become a less valuable asset over time because parking structures are going to accommodate more vehicles because autonomous vehicles will be able to park very closely, and there will likely be less use of long-term parking on streets as people are using transportation network companies and ride shares to commute within cities. We've also got to anticipate your needs around bicycling and the broader transit development you're trying to do within the community. Another key issue that Metro emphasized was they wanted to minimize environmental impacts. And we think that by modernizing the system, using technology such as wayfinding, so that when you leave your home, not only can you find out where you're going to go using wayfinding or apps, you may even be able to find the parking space you're going to go to. So imagine when you leave your house, opening up your phone and seeing all of the available parking spots in downtown Nashville, including on-street spots that you could use. The concept there is that's going to reduce transit times. It's going to reduce circling downtown where you have people driving around the block looking for parking. And finally, we want to make sure that parking remains affordable and that it is an asset that people can access. But Metro asked us to consider how we could create an upfront payment for the city to be paid over a couple of years and preserve the net revenue stream that parking now creates for the city. The parking system between permits and tickets and paid meter usage generates an average of about $1.5 million a year. And Metro asked us to ensure that for the duration of the agreement that it continued to deliver that amount of money to the city, inflation adjusted over time. So those are two of the financial metrics that were incorporated into our analysis. Let's jump to page 4, if we can. Okay, I think we're too far ahead, so let's back up a couple of pages. One more page. There we go. So what were the objectives? We talked about the principles on the prior page, and so there's a little bit of overlap here, but what were the objectives that we were given? We want to make sure we improve the parking experience for retail customers. We want to use technology to reduce congestion and to limit the amount of driving around people do looking for a space. We want to support the process of neighborhood parking, street sweeping, valet, and rush hour management. Each of those are important areas within the broader parking ecosystem. And Metro asked that we consider how we could incorporate the administrative management of those issues in an agreement. And I want to emphasize again that the policies around those would remain with the Traffic and Parking Commission. We're talking about the administrative enforcement, the wrench turning, if you will, on managing those would be done by a partner. We want to increase the system reliability and reduce downtime. The most well-run systems ought to have meters that are up 98 to 99% of the time. We want to increase convenient and payment options so that people can pay on their phone or with a credit card. We also want people to be able to extend parking if they're in a spot and time's about ready to expire and they're at a meeting or at a lunch. We want them to be able to extend that meter on their phone without leaving the meeting or the restaurant that they're in to dramatically improve convenience. And lastly, to go back to a point I started with, we want to produce real-time and accurate data for the city, and particularly for the Traffic and Parking Commission, as it makes policy decisions into the future. Next slide, please. Thank you, sir. So let's talk about some of our due diligence. What we're proposing here is new to Nashville, but it is not new in the world of parking management. Private partners support public sector parking operations across the U.S. and across the world. This has been a real area of innovation over the last decade, principally driven by smartphones, which are able to automate many of the activities associated with parking and parking management. So this is an activity that well-run cities are using throughout the world. So we're not boldly leaping into the future here. We're just really catching up with what some of the leading cities in the world are already doing. In terms of the structure we're talking about, we've looked at a number of structures, and the one we came upon based upon the city's goals and their objectives was what we call a concession agreement. And a concession agreement is simply an agreement between the city and a private partner where the city allows that private partner to administer an operation subject to the city's oversight and their rules and policies. So you would continue to be responsible for all the policies associated with the assets in your community, but you would have someone else handling the administrative tasks associated with that under your supervision. And we would contemplate that any partner would be in front of this commission regularly for reporting, which we would anticipate would be pretty intense early on, probably monthly, till you establish a rapport with them. Then eventually that may move to quarterly. That would be a level of reporting on your system that you don't have to this day, and a level of detail. And we would anticipate all sorts of questions and new ideas coming out of that process for the Traffic and Parking Commission. So why do we hit upon the concession model? It has a number of advantages, and we've got a few of them listed here. One, concessions can include upfront payments for communities. Your parking assets are valuable, and an upfront payment is something that is not unprecedented. In fact, there are transactions around the country where they've used very, very large upfront payments. In talking with Metro early on in the process, though, Metro took what I would say is an appropriate and a more modest approach about the upfront payment. They said, we don't want to leverage this asset with a massive upfront payment, right? An upfront payment may be appropriate, but what we'd really like to do is enter into a partnership with a manager here and then share in the improved net revenue over time. So the model we've contemplated has three financial components. One is this upfront payment I've described. Two is a recurring revenue stream that's equal to the net revenue stream the city's getting today, and that would inflation adjust over time. And then the third piece is that the city would share in any additional revenue beyond that amount over time. The other advantage of a concession is that the partner would be responsible for all of the capital expenditures required to upgrade the system over the life of the system. So you wouldn't be taking risk for new meters or multi-space meters or other technology. You would have insight and approval into those technologies because your policies would guide what technologies were implemented, but the city would not be on the hook for the financial cost of implementing those technologies. As I mentioned a moment ago, it also creates an opportunity for revenue sharing over the term of the agreement, because we think as the operations are improved and as Metro continues to grow over time, that your system will likely generate a recurring net revenue stream beyond the guaranteed payment we described. And then a feature that we've included in transactions in the past, which Metro consented to, is an exit ramp if at some point in time you wanted to exit the agreement. We recommended that you have the ability to do that every 10 years. We're proposing a concession that's 30 years in length. And the exit ramp allows you, should there be some dramatic change in the future that we haven't anticipated, it would allow you to exit the agreement at a predetermined price every decade. And what type of a change might that be? So let's say that our assumptions about autonomous vehicles are all wrong, right? And we don't have autonomous vehicles in the future. Everybody's driving, and you have actually more traffic downtown than you have today, and the demand for your parking is much higher than you think. You may conclude at some point in the future, we'd like to be back in that parking business. This would allow you to do that. Now, we're going to structure the financial arrangements in a way where we don't want there to be a strong incentive to do that, because you're going to continue to share in revenue. So as as growth in your city occurs and as there's more demand for parking in the future, you will continue to share a majority of that revenue off into the future. But some people say, boy, 30 years is a long time. What if the world really changes? So we would suggest that you include that just as a safety valve. And then finally, a concession agreement, as I've said, allows you to use automation and innovation to dramatically improve the customer service experience. And I don't want to speak for the members of the review team, but when you say something like that, it usually means you're getting ready to do just that. So having said that, I will now speak for them. I think folks have received a lot of insight into all the innovation that is out there with parking, things that people might not have been aware of before. And I'll just use one small example. And again, we're not advocating this for Metro, but it is an example of what technology allows us to do today. What we are seeing communities do who are strapped for parking is they're using their private partners to help them identify and incorporate parking that belongs to third parties into the system. So I'll give you an example there, and I don't want to get too carried away with this, but it's just an example. Where you have high demand for parking in a commercial node adjacent to a residential area, say on a Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night, technology now allows us to incorporate parking from an organization in that area who's not part of your parking system, but on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday nights, your parking app might allow you to rent a space in a parking lot that's not yours. And again, we're not advocating that as a solution, but those types of technology solutions are used frequently around the country. So you can think of it as kind of an Airbnb for parking, and that's done in collaboration with that parking owner, but it allows you to address your planning and economic development needs without having to go acquire more curb space or acquire more parking. And that's obviously done on a case-by-case basis. But those types of solutions, I think, would be available to you in the future in this type of an agreement. So let's walk through some policy changes on slide 7 and 8. As part of the process, we have talked with cities across the country and have talked with the vendors who responded to the procurement process about a very broad range of policy changes for your community. And those policy changes ranged from do nothing to very, very, very aggressive policy changes. And we found, I think, kind of the middle approach, we'll call it the Goldilocks approach, about right, we think, after lots of analysis and after lots of financial analysis by Dan. So I'll walk through these policy changes. These are not the most extreme ones, but we do think that they probably make sense for a rapidly growing and vibrant community like Nashville. So we'll just walk through them here on the slide.
Skip, can I interrupt you for 1 second? Just
Of course.
because of the technology glitch here. So I think your monitors are not working, is that correct? So those are over there. So if the print is too small, because I doubled up the slides on the hard copy, they're roughly in the same order as the memo from the mayor. So if it's easier to follow along the narrative in the memo, feel free to do that if your monitor's not working up there.
So the first policy change we discussed was enforcement hours. Your existing hours are generally from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. The proposal is to move those from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. That is consistent with what other larger cities in Tennessee are doing, and is generally consistent with what other growing cities are doing around the country. And we've got data from Austin, Minneapolis, and Denver in the slide deck as well. Currently, there are not Sunday hours for enforcement. The proposal is that you would move to Sunday hours for enforcement that are consistent with Monday through Saturday. Again, the non-enforcement on Sunday typically comes from communities where there wasn't a lot going on Sundays. Sundays were pretty light times in communities. Nashville's got a lot going on these days, and so analogous to other leading cities, Minneapolis, Portland, and Denver, we're proposing you consider Sunday hours. Meter rates is the third item there. Your meter rates are I'd either describe them as highly competitive or low compared to your peer cities. And we looked at lots of options here, and Metro has settled on what I think is a pretty modest option, and that would be to increase meter rates by $0.25 per hour. and then move to a CPI, a Consumer Price Index factor over time. And that would be comparable with other communities in the state, but you would still be underpriced relative to a number of other cities around the country. And I'm not suggesting that's a good or a bad thing. That's just a benchmark for you. The next policy issue is to have your partner administer street sweeping enforcement, valet parking, loading zones, and residential permits, again, subject to you making the policy decisions associated with who gets a permit, why they get a permit. This is the administration of those processes. And for things like residential permits, for example, that can be done now almost entirely online in a completely automated fashion. So if you think about having a visitor come into an area where a parking permit is required, you don't have to go downtown and get a placard from Metro and put it in their windshield. You can literally take out a phone, input their license plate, and put in the time they're going to get there till the time they're going to leave, and then they are then permitted to be there. Whether there are fees associated with that is utterly up to Metro, but the administration of that can be done entirely online now, and typically on a smartphone. Moving on to page 8, we looked at your fine structure. Your fine structure is very low. The proposal is that be increased to $25 from $11. I want to emphasize this is not about generating revenue from fines. Generating revenue from fines is an inefficient way to gather money in a parking system. The efficient way to gather money in a parking system is to have people pay for parking. And to the extent you can do that on a phone, it's much easier to do. And in fact, in the models we've looked at, fines go down over time as people become accustomed to using their phones to pay the meters. And that is, in fact, the objective, because what we want people to do is to comply with your rules. We don't want to generate a bunch of revenue from fines because, one, it's a bad customer service experience, and two, it's just incredibly inefficient. What we want to do is drive compliance with your rules. Next item is spaces. When we initially looked at your meter footprint in the community, the reaction was you had a lot of available curb space to add meters. It was the conclusion after our due diligence and discussions with Metro that we didn't want to meter every available foot in the community. And so as opposed to metering what was available, the conclusion was over the next several years to add about 2,000 spaces to your footprint. And that fills about half of the available space you have based upon just linear square feet in your community. We think there's demand for that. And obviously, if there's not demand for that, you don't put the meter in, because putting a meter in that nobody uses is just a bad use of capital dollars. So you would be looking at data. You need engineering analysis to determine whether you wanted to continue to add meters in your community or not. Because again, just putting a meter in the ground just to have one there is not very effective. And that would make you a little larger, for example, than Austin is today. It would make you almost identical to what Indianapolis is in their downtown area. We've got about 4,000 meters, but smaller than places like New Orleans, Denver, and Minneapolis. One of the questions that came up during our discussions with Metro staff is, hey, we've got a lot of activity going on downtown. There's construction, we have special events. We want to take meters out of service, and we want to be able to do that without a penalty, right? We don't want to have to pay our partner to take a meter out of service. And so we proposed that you could take 150 meters out of service without any financial impact. Now, the transaction will be structured in a way that you will have an incentive not to take meters out of service because you're sharing in the revenue from the system, right? So the community will not have an incentive to take 1,000 meters out of service because you're spending your own money in that circumstance. But we do want to provide you with the flexibility during special events or during a construction project to bag meters or take them out of service. And we don't want to have to go through counting meters every day to figure out what the impact of that is. So we're going to create just a bucket that allows you to take meters out of service. There are a number of bikeway projects that are currently in progress. We've listed them here at the bottom of the page. Those would be contemplated as part of any transaction. The final policy issue is you have a current green permit system that is not used extensively. There were 142 green permits issued, I think, in the last year. If you look out over time, over a 30-year period, maintaining that program represents a pretty significant potential financial impact. It could be $100 million over the next 30 years, because in 20 or 25 years, a majority of the vehicles that are going to be produced are likely to be green vehicles, and so they're going to come into your system naturally. People won't be incented to go buy them. That's going to be the car that's available for them to buy, and over time, that will likely dramatically reduce the revenue from the system if you have 2/3 of the vehicles parking on your streets capable of having a green permit. So we would encourage you to phase that out over time. Doesn't have to be done overnight, but over time, we think that's probably something you'd want to do. And part of the rationale for that is to the extent you want to achieve green outcomes, that may not be the most feasible way to do it, right? You can probably achieve better green outcomes with a rethinking of how you do your green permits than if you were to continue that program. So I'm going to go mercifully to the last slide here. So what could a long-term concession agreement be worth to the community? Now, this is subject to a lot of variables, and we don't have a negotiated contract yet. But based upon looking at comparable transactions around the country, including my adopted hometown of Indianapolis, looking at large transactions at Ohio State University in eastern Michigan, and a number of other communities, we think that the system could be worth anywhere between $250 to $350 million over the 30-year concession. Now, part of that is just natural growth you're going to get out of the system. We anticipate most of that value, though, will come from just improved management of the system. And I'll give you just a couple of quick examples. Again, in Indianapolis, which has been under a concession for about a decade, one of the first recommendations that came back from the vendor back then was, we think we ought to reduce meter rates in this area, because they had real-time data that said people aren't using those meters, but we know from studying the system that they're parking across the street or they're parking in a garage. And we think if we lower those meter rates and then extend the time limits from 2 to 4 hours, we can bring customers back. And in fact, that's what they were able to do. So it seems counterintuitive, but some of the time the way you bring customers back is by lowering prices. There will be places where you have meters now, where over time you probably don't want to have meters. They're not effective. There's not demand, and you'll have areas elsewhere. We were talking about the stray meter a moment ago, where you don't have meters. Well, you will want to have meters, and that'll be driven by new development, whether it's a new hotel or a new office building. And all of those variables, we think, will impact it over time. But we think the value of your concession is pretty significant to the community. And I've listed just a couple of other transactions there at the bottom of the page. Indianapolis, which I mentioned, and in that transaction, it's a model very similar to what Nashville's looking at. There was a modest upfront payment, and then revenue sharing over time, and I just put a couple of factoids over there. That was a 900% increase in net revenue to the community, and most of that was driven by operating improvements, right? We had a relatively weak meter uptime, and meter uptimes are now at the 99% level, and that just drives enforcement, right? When the meter's working, people pay the meter. If it's not working, there's no revenue in that meter. Ohio State University, which is kind of a unique transaction because it was the entire campus, involved lots of on-street and off-street parking. Ohio State University wanted all of their money up front for their parking transaction. Very significant transaction, almost $500 million. And then I included Chicago as the last one. Chicago has been widely derided around the country. People say we're interested in doing this, but we don't want to do Chicago. So I'm not here to comment on Chicago other than to say it's not the model we're using here, right? Chicago was a $1 billion upfront payment. We're not talking about that. We're talking about a revenue sharing transaction over time where the community and the Traffic and Parking Commission and your partner are in goal alignment, right? So with that, I'm going to pause and
One more point. at the bottom of that page about outsourcing, right? So, and I can cover this one. So as part of any potential outsourcing in Metro, of course, we want to look at potential employee impacts. And after looking and doing the analysis, after talking to the Director of Public Works and the Circuit Court Clerk and working with HR a little bit, at this point, there are no anticipated layoffs of Metro employees as a result of this project. So we wanted to mention that. So I think our presentation of the information at this point, I think, is finished. Chair, we'd be glad to answer any questions at this point.
All right, thank you. Ms. Costonis, we have 10 items presented here. I think you've indicated a couple of these are direct action items and some are conceptual. So if you can kind of review what exactly we are kind of charged or tasked with today, please, ma'am.
Yes, certainly. So as you know, there are some things that you have direct authority over in the charter and the code. The way we are proceeding with this is asking you to approve 2 items that you have that kind of authority over in advance of an agreement with any vendor to perform these services. And the reason for that is because it is easier for us to negotiate with them if we have certainty on these issues than in the absence of that. So those 2 issues are extending the hours. We believe that any vendor that we end up contracting with will probably want to be able to capture those evening hours from 6 to 10 that you don't previously have. That we don't do any traffic enforcement during those hours, because this would be a situation where it is a little bit contingent because we don't have that agreement yet. We had talked about doing that effective July 1. Our timeline is to hope to have this done before the end of the fiscal year, and to have it be contingent on the closing of a deal with a vendor to perform these services. The second item that you have that kind of authority to do is rates. So the recommendation would be a very small rate increase, and we would ask that that not be effective until 1 year from now, and that is a 25-cent increase in current parking meter rates.
Excuse me, what would be the effective date? Is that July 1 of 2020 or is it?
I think we'd want to do it 1 year after a successfully executed contract.
Okay.
Yeah, but the reason for waiting, I think, is data gathering opportunities.
Okay.
So those 2 things, like I said, that would help with the negotiation once we have a contractor. So we are asking you to take those 2 actions today. The rest of it is very much like kind of mirror reflection of the memo and the presentation that you saw today. Is basically we're asking you all for your impressions and ideally your conceptual approval of the elements of this program that were just presented to you. And so items 3 through 9, or sort of 10, of the other items under the parking modernization agenda set out are the ones that I'm talking about in that regard.
We need to make a note that our current hours of operation for our parking meters are 8 a.m. till 6 p.m., and this proposal will be 8 a.m. till 10 p.m.
That's correct. Thank you, Diane.
Okay. Thank you. So I know lots of the commissioners have questions. Ms. Woods.
My question is about the extension of the meter parking hours. Even with signs, people are not going to read them. They're going to be used to things happening, being able to park somewhere on Sundays, come to a Titans game and walk. Can there be like a grace period with a warning for like a week or 2 just to tell people this is what's happening, or is that, how does that work with the model?
This requires an enormous amount of outreach. So once a vendor is selected, we would contemplate, subject to your and Metro's approval, right, a communications plan, website setup, stakeholder, maybe neighborhood meetings. I mean, I've done a lot of neighborhood association meetings, stakeholder meetings on this, and then getting the signage right. I park all over the country for work, and some places it's very obvious, some places it is not. So I think that the goal here isn't to write a bunch of tickets over a 3-day period after transition. That doesn't do you any good. It doesn't do your customers any good. And quite frankly, your vendor won't be interested in that, right? Because they'll take the heat for that. So I think there are a bunch of things we can do on communication that will be even more effective than a grace period. But I think we're open to whatever the Traffic and Parking Commission wants to do in that regard.
And through working with a partner, I mean, we will, these companies do this all over the United States, all over the world. I mean, they have faced these kinds of issues in other cities, and we'll be able to apply those lessons. And so one example here, very concrete example I know is going to come up, is, we have several churches in the meter footprint that rely on and have a lot of need for parking during service hours. So all of that will be very carefully planned for, and having a partner in place that they'll have ideas probably better than anything we could dream up.
So yes, Ms. Costello.
I just wanted to make one more point, which was that this was not, by no means, the last time that this matter would come before this commission before it is consummated. We fully anticipate that this issue will be back on your agenda for April, and that at that point in time, some of the things that are kind of more conceptual today would be before you for concrete recommendation to the council.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So I think this is a good time to allow commissioners to ask questions. I also want to note that Mr. Durbin, who's our Metro IT Director, is here to address any questions about technology as it impacts Metro, so he can be a source of resource. So, does there anyone like to go first?
I have just a general question about enforcement of things like loading zones, residents who need to unload groceries and then move their car, and they're in a loading zone in the commercial district. Describe what the enforcement process is for this, how you visualize somebody coming along and checking loading zone times, and especially commercial vehicles down there downtown working. I mean, I have lots of questions about that.
Did you reach your mic, Terry? I don't want to, if you were going to comment, go ahead.
You can go ahead first.
First of all, they're going to enforce your policies, right? So whatever your policies are on enforcing will be what they will do. I also want to mention that Metro was clear that public safety had to retain the authority to write tickets. So we're contemplating that would continue, and ideally we would get that integrated on the same technology system so that we're not using paper tickets, right? We want to move to a fully automated handheld ticketing system that documents the violation, likely with photographs, and that would be handled electronically as contrasted with a paper ticket. But they said that Metro had to retain the ability to write tickets, so we've contemplated that. But in terms of enforcement, while they may be using different tools, they may be using a handheld or something that looks like an iPad to do enforcement, they'll only be enforcing whatever your policies are for and whatever you deem to be a violation, right? So they won't be inventing any new violations. If you want something enforced, they will enforce that infraction subject to your policies and procedures. So whatever the current practice is for someone unloading groceries is the practice they would follow.
Another question about what's the plan about the scooters?
Thought that was a different committee.
I mean, enforcement of the scooters, because where are they going to park?
Yeah, in my 30 years of public management, I never thought I would have had so many conversations about scooters around the country. Again, we've talked about developing a curb space management protocol. Again, they will be enforcing whatever your rules are. What we think of as the curb is going to evolve substantially in the years to come, right? The curb used to be something you stepped over to get to your car, but it is a place of business now. There are transactions there, and your curb real estate is some of the most valuable real estate you have in the city. And I've seen your scooter profile. You seem to have a lot of them here. You have TNCs. We talked with public safety about their concerns about TNCs unloading passengers in the middle of streets for events and walking across lanes of traffic. So again, subject to whatever the state requirements are and whatever your local rules are, that would be the enforcement regime that we would propose. Now, I am certain that our partners will have ideas on that, because they may work in scores or even hundreds of other cities where they've addressed these issues. And my hope would be that you would pose these types of questions to them as an onboard policy advisor to you. They would bring back options, quite frankly, options I can't even contemplate now about how we might do that. What's the global best practice for managing this? Because this is not an issue of first impression here in Nashville, and that you would then collaborate with them on a policy and then an enforcement of that policy that meets your overall objectives.
I have one more question.
Let's continue.
So you talked about allowing 150 meters to be bagged. How many meters currently get bagged for events I guess that's a course of a year, right? The 150 meters?
Well, you can have up to 150 out of the system at any one time.
At any one time.
Yes,
Is there a limit as to how many will be allowed over the course of a 12-month period?
No, well, we hadn't anticipated any kind of cumulative accounting for it. I mean, and there's different ways. There's different ways to do this. I mean, so very helpfully, Diane provided some data from the last 2 years for me to look through, and there's some room for improvement in the way that the database works in terms of providing good information to really try to analyze. But best I could tell, on average, we kind of fluctuate between 80 and 100 meters bagged, roughly, at any given time. Given this is new, and I think you want to take a pretty conservative approach when you're implementing a new system, and talking to Public Works about it, and just making sure that we don't constrain ourselves unnecessarily. We went ahead and just bumped that up to 150. And in talking to the vendors about that, it's not really going to give anybody heartburn. To a large extent, they are somewhat agnostic about which meters you take, because if we've got some upward mobility in the total meter count, we can simply swap some for others. But yeah, there won't. I mean, 150 based on the last 2 years at least should be plenty. And that only occurs 2 or 3 times a year when we have this confluence of events on downtown.
Other questions? Yes, Ms. Woods.
So when someone gets a ticket or has a violation and they don't agree, who do they call, or what's their recourse? If they feel like they've been unfairly penalized, what's the recourse?
Terry, why don't you jump in and explain kind of where our current thinking is about enforcement in that regard?
Yeah, so you may have seen me sort of nod my head when Skip was referring to constraints of state law. We do not think at this time that it is possible for a non-governmental employee to issue a citation without some metro oversight. So this would have to be a system of enforcement that would be collaborative between government and the private party. And so people would not lose the due process rights that they have currently. They would still have opportunities to appeal citations, just like they do now.
And just as a policy matter, we just think that makes sense, right? public body needs to make the final decision here. Are there ways to streamline that and make it more efficient? While having access to a time-stamped set of photos from a ticket reduce discussions about whether I was or was not there? Likely, but in the end, we think that the public sector should have the final policy decisions, right?
And they will always go through the courts here, no matter what.
Well, let me ask legal. Are you saying then if private person issues the citation, because the process now is if we disagree, we can go to court and argue about it. So you're saying they wouldn't be able to, they couldn't go to court and argue, they couldn't enforce it that way, correct?
No, I'm saying that they could.
They could do that?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to make sure of.
Do you want to? It might help clear it up if you explain kind of the two-step process we've been talking about.
So and this is sort of hypothetical. We don't actually have a contractor in place who has agreed to do it this way. And it's, based kind of, like I said, on kind of existing constraints that we perceive with state law. But the idea would be that that you might have vendor employees in the field observing the actual violations, that they would then communicate that information to a Metro employee, show the evidence that would support the violation, and that it would actually then be based on an analysis of that evidence, the Metro employee who, hopefully, technology permitting, pushes a button to issue the citation.
Well, that's the only thing I'm asking, though. You'd still have to have a metropolitan oversight person to issue the citation to make it enforceable. Okay.
The current parking patrol officers would remain on duty on their tasks, right?
I'm not really equipped to answer operational questions like that, but yes, you would have to have some Metro employees involved in the process.
So in talking to Director Sturdivant about this, there are always going to have to be employees at Public Works to manage this contract and to oversee the system and serve as staff to you all as you're making policy decisions about it. And looking at potentially outsourced employees and coming to the determination that that was not going to be necessary, I think there's going to be some future discussion about duties shifting a little bit. Obviously, if we are going to replace all of the old coin-operated meters, if there was somebody whose sole job was performing maintenance on those meters, then there's going to have to be a discussion about what related duties could be accomplished. So we can't say that nobody's job duties are not going to be impacted here, because they will be. But according to Director Sturdivant, it won't mean anybody's going to lose a job by implementing the system.
Okay. I guess our concern from the police department aspect would be, it sounds like the enforcement's going to fall upon the police department or the current Public Works parking patrol. All of our enforcement efforts are going to be based upon priority. We have to prioritize everything based on emergency situations. So is there going to be somebody out there that's calling the police saying, hey, I've got this parking violation over here? Okay, well, we'll stand by. We'll be there directly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours later, because it's going to keep getting bumped down the priority list based on the need for emergency services. Is there anything in the plan that's going to finance or provide funds for people to do the enforcement? That's their sole purpose of their job, I guess is what I'm asking. Or is it going to be a collateral duty of police officers, which I can tell you right now, it's going to fall down their priority list pretty quickly.
So let me just make sure I understand what you're saying. So do you mean an employee of a vendor would be documenting a violation of parking and then wanting to report that back to a Metro entity as part of the process that Terry was describing, and you want to make sure that that other person is not going to be taken away from other duties as a Metro police officer?
They're going to have to call a Metro employee to come write the citation, correct?
But so a lot of this is to be worked out, but the idea hopefully is no. I mean, the idea is that you would document, and so this is what Terry was describing, you would document the violation, hopefully electronically, and then that information would be sent to a Metro employee. And that could be somebody sitting at a desk inside an office.
Okay.
That wouldn't have to be somebody from the police department needing to come to a scene to issue a citation.
Okay.
And I would add that state law and the Metro code both permit non-police employees to issue citations on matters over which they are given jurisdiction. So Public Works employees could perform that function. MNPD would not need to.
Okay.
And just some general information, the Department of Public Works currently has 5 enforcement officers, and we write approximately 250 tickets a day, just for general information.
Questions, Ms. Kern?
Well, I guess I have a comment and a couple of related questions. I mean, overall, I think it seems pretty exciting in that I think a lot of our parking isn't currently managed particularly effectively. It's hard to find spots. We're not really making best use of it. And I'm definitely very excited about the data because I think that'll help us as commissioners, I mean, around neighborhood permits and valet especially, where we often are making decisions in the dark. I did have 2 questions. One, I guess, related to rates, and then kind of a related one. It seems like it would make sense at some point to move more towards a dynamic parking, and I think that's definitely what I've seen in other dynamic pricing system where, you know, the rates in 12 South might need to be different than downtown. And obviously that's not the way it is set up right now. And so I was just kind of curious if that had been envisioned, and it seems like that could make a lot of sense at some point in the future, maybe not in the next year. And then related, if you could touch a little bit on with money that is raised, my understanding is that doesn't go into the general fund. So could you kind of touch on if there is increased revenue stream, what that goes to?
Let's do the second one first, Terry, because I think you can knock that out pretty quick.
Yes, according to section 11907 of the charter, that money would go into a dedicated fund for traffic and parking improvements.
Skip, you want to start? Sorry.
Ms. Wood, you have a follow-up?
Would that include additional employees for Public Works? Or, you know, if we need to hire more people to do these jobs, is that part of that? Would that funding go for that, or is it just for physical stuff?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I would be inclined to think certainly that any capital improvements, you know, projects, that kind of thing, it could go toward that. Whether the hiring of additional staff could be included within the word improvements as it is used in that charter section, I think would be more questionable. That seems more operational, but I haven't actually researched that issue.
You're correct. It's, in the past, it's gone to capital funding.
Yeah.
Now, money is money, so somehow it comes off both. You know, maybe if you got more capital, your operating doesn't get hit as hard either. So.
I'm not the expert on this, but Brian may know this better, that
Okay.
felt like we did not have a shortage of traffic and parking improvements that those funds could be used towards.
Yeah, and again, I mean, we have not negotiated a contract yet, but I mean, if you look at this, at kind of the projected long-term revenue and look at it on an annual basis, you're talking about 4 to 5 times what we're currently getting in net operating income for the meter. So this is going to provide significantly more resources to Public Works to do this kind of work. Dynamic pricing, do you want to just explain what it is, and then maybe I can explain why we didn't go all the way there for this?
Yeah, dynamic pricing is pricing that moves based upon real-time demand. So in areas where there is significant demand, pricing would move up to meet that demand, and where areas where there is little demand, pricing would go down in order to meet that demand. Within the parking arena, you think about in a perfect parking environment, you'd have 80 or 85% of the spots on a block face filled at any one time. That means if somebody's coming down and wants to go to a restaurant or a retail establishment, there are 1 or 2 spaces on that block face open, but there wouldn't be 9 spaces open. And so and dynamic pricing allows you to then do that. Did you want to comment on why we?
Right. So for example, Seattle. So Seattle has dynamic pricing, and you can see rates go up to $5 an hour, in peak period, high demand areas. So we did have actually a lot of discussion about this and kind of where rate changes would fit in kind of the overall changes we're proposing here. And there is some interest in possibly looking at dynamic pricing. That's why we made the mention in the memo from the mayor about it. That's something that I think the commission ought to take up, get through a year of implementation. Let's get the new system up and operational, and maybe 12 months after that, you guys might want to look at it. But we don't, this is going to be a lot of change. And you don't want to kind of bite off more than you can chew at one time, right? And thinking about, some circumstances in places like Chicago and others where you saw really fast, immediate, significant rate increases on the front end. To us, that just didn't seem like the way to go about this. We want to make sure that, we were very conservative on any price changes, and so, Nashville, we are comparable to other Tennessee cities. We are behind some other cities, some markets that I feel like are fairly comparable places to us. But we didn't want to give anybody sticker shock and suggest going all the way dynamic pricing at this point. But it is worth, I think, some attention in the future.
Councilmember Hager, you have a question?
How many people are going to be in this RFP process? I mean, how many contractors are out there that do this?
So we've already gone through the procurement process. There were 5 teams that submitted proposals. And if you don't mind, Councilmember, if we can hold on the procurement, because I can give you guys some information about kind of where that stands, but I want to make sure we answer all the questions about the policy changes first. But I will come back to it if you're okay with that.
Fine. Commissioners, do you have other questions?
I have a short technology question. So do you foresee that I decide I want to drive myself downtown, and is there going to be a place on my app that I can reserve a meter or reserve a place before I leave home?
We are proposing an open architecture system, right? What we don't want to do is tie you to a particular technology. So it is our hope and our plan, and I know I've got some IT folks behind me here, that parking apps of a variety, from a variety of potential partners could fit into your system. Nashville has about 40 or 50,000 people today in Metro Nashville who already use parking apps, and they use them obviously in other communities or when they travel. But you've got a lot of folks who are already using parking apps here, even though they are probably not using them to park here. So yes, we contemplate you being able to open your phone, find a parking spot, find the price of that parking spot, and if the app allows it, to reserve it. And over time, you want to think about how you integrate not only the on-street parking, but also third-party parking and garage parking, because you want to provide customers with the most efficient solution to their transit. And over the very long term, right, that's going to connect, we want to think about transit. So we want to think, how does that ride tie in with public transit? How does that ride tie in with an Uber or a Lyft, or dare I say it, a scooter to go that last mile? But what's the continuum of transit options you have to get from point A to point B in the most efficient, in the greenest and the quickest and least costly way? So we anticipate all of that functionality will come together over time. In DC, for example, I can reserve a spot when I leave my house downtown.
And I'm not clear about how this parking plan plays into valet parking, because, I mean, is this one big thing, or is valet still going to be separate, Brian? Or
So you will always retain policy authority over everything you do today. So yeah, we hope that administration of valet parking will become part of this agreement with the private party. In the memo, we went to great length to explain that we aren't simply just going to revoke everybody's permits, on any one particular day. Everybody's permits are going to be honored until they expire. We're not going to jump the gun and do something before we have a system that's been fully implemented. So there's going to be plenty of lead time to kind of get everybody used to what we're doing. And I know there are going to be lots of questions on residential permit parking, valet, loading zones. And so I expect us to have have a lot of discussion at future meetings with the commission here about those things. But yeah, we do intend to
But
have them
where,
part of the
where
system.
those occur and when they occur will remain policy decisions, right? We're talking about the partner just administering that. So if you want a valet space here, okay, you put a valet space here, your partner will administer the issuance of that subject to your criteria and your rules. But the policies around whether there are more or fewer of them, we never want to give that to a partner, right? We want to reserve that for you.
And I know that we're repeating that a lot, but it's important because when you look at places like Chicago that have done this badly, that's where it went wrong. I mean, they simply just ceded too much control over policy and did not have a commission performing that function. So we're being repetitive, I know, but it's worth repeating.
Okay. Commissioner Kern.
Yeah, I just had another question, which you kind of touched on, but thought it might be helpful to go into a little bit more. If there was, I think flexibility will be really important also for encouraging people not to drive downtown, whether it's a scooter lane or a bus lane or a Lyft, Uber drop-off lane on Lower Broadway. You kind of touched on the flexibility, but if, for example, we wanted to take out all the parking on 2nd Avenue to make it Uber drop-off or whatever, or if we wanted to put a bus lane to Music City Central, how would that kind of function in this contract if in 5 years that was a decision the city made?
So again, this is a point of negotiation with the vendor. So some of this is a little TBD. But the way this will work is if we are looking for, let's say, 400 spaces, like let's say someday we have high capacity transit or dedicated lanes downtown. Once we surpass whatever number of meters is in that basket or that bucket, there's going to have to be some kind of recourse from a company that's upfront funded a lot of capital investment in new meter and camera technology, right? So there will be mechanisms in the contract that govern those kinds of events. And that's good for everybody. That's good for us because we have to wrestle with the fact that if we do something like that, we're going to be spending our own money on the revenue share side, right? But retain policy control over the ability to do that. And from the vendor's perspective, obviously, if you're going to put many millions of dollars into new capital, you want to make sure that we don't change our mind 6 months later and tell them to go out and rip all that back out, right? Without having some kind of way to address that. So yeah, that will be described, at length in the contract, what happens, how it would happen, and sort of what that threshold is that would trigger one of those compensation events.
And could you just, like if we took out meters on whatever, leading into Music City Central, could you just put 5 more in somewhere else? Would that be like a way of addressing that, or is that still?
No, so if we have, we're asking you guys to, I guess, I'm not sure what the term is here, positively signal your support for, being able to kind of ramp up the meter footprint, by 500 per year over 4 years. I mean, we think the system could be expanded in a logical way that way. And from talking to the vendors kind of through this process, they are going to be sort of largely agnostic, especially early on, because they won't really have data until, 6 months, a year in that says, okay, meter A is worth this amount and, potential meter B is worth this amount. So is that a fair trade or not, right? I mean, we need access to that kind of information in order to kind of do that horse trading, right? But I mean, I think there's going to be flexibility in an expanded system in order to do that. When we started talking about these bike lane projects, that didn't really cause any heartburn for anybody. So yes, one day we may have dedicated lanes for transit, and if the city decides to do that, then, there will be mechanisms to make that happen in the contract.
Are there other questions? Okay. Thank you for the segue, because that was actually, my question was, or relates to, when you start getting this data back, then is that the tool you use to determine where you expand? I mean, we know that Hillsborough Village is different than downtown, or Murfreesboro Road is different than downtown, but explain how data is kind of used to make decisions about where you might make expansions of the parking footprint, please.
I think data is one, but I also think you'll have an engineering analysis. Public Works will have an interest. I think you'll need to involve planning in that process. And I think you'll need some stakeholder input, right? You may have stakeholders who care a lot about having more parking or who don't want more parking. So I think all of those will be helpful. But to the extent that you begin getting data that talks about when is a parking meter used, what day, what time, what's the intensity, what's the demand, that will begin to help you understand whether we need more parking in the area or we don't. And you're going to get it at a granularity level that is really quite striking, literally by space and by time. And to the extent that in an area you have all the spaces filled all the time with paid meter usage, that's probably a pretty good indicator that we need to add spaces in the periphery. If we always have 3 or 4 spaces open in a block face, that tells us we probably don't need more spaces there, and in fact, maybe we want to lower rates or extend the hours someone can stay there. And that data will come in. It's really quite extraordinary, and then you will begin making policy decisions. And what we want to create is a partnership, so you can ask questions, and your partner becomes a long-term policy advisor to you. Your interests will be aligned economically around the infrastructure and these other issues. And you may say, you know, I heard some of the earlier comments about adding and deleting infrastructure. You will have real information about whether that makes sense based upon demand from your partners. You know, how's the curb space being used beyond that? Those types of things, I think, will be pretty powerful.
And just in terms of how this will work with policymakers, you know, there are some areas we've named here kind of within the existing footprint where we think it makes sense. A couple council members who are outside of the existing footprint have said, well, you know, how can we talk about expanding the system beyond the footprint? And we are never going to, in any kind of contractual way, say, you know what, in 12 months, you know, there are going to be meters in 5 points without the council member and the community driving that conversation. And so, you know, I don't want to leave anybody with the expectation that, you know, we're going to enter into some kind of agreement that's going to, you know, expand the boundaries of the system beyond where there's support
my
for it.
point of my question is we now have data to make decisions, whereas I know in the past, speaking to Ms. Kern's point, I mean, we many times have put parking meters, made decisions about meters simply because, well, we need to put meters there so cars don't sit there all day, whether that's the best place or if there's additional places, we've been kind of in the dark or throwing darts at a dartboard. Seems like a good idea.
Right.
So,
Right.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
I don't want
other?
to,
Yes.
excuse me, Chair, I don't want to forget about the council member's question about
Yes.
procurement. So Terry, if you don't mind, I'm going to let you answer this first, and then I'll jump in and probably cause a problem, but let's let you do it first.
So the original RFQ that was issued proceeded to the stage where there was an intent to award, and then at the point when we were in negotiations with the proposed successful bidder during that period, the purchasing agent actually made a decision to terminate that solicitation. It was not a waste of time because we learned a great deal, but we realized that there was some confusion in the original solicitation, and very frankly, maybe some better ways to do things. So at this point in time, the solicitation is in the process of being redrafted and reissued. So one of the changes that we have decided to make in how we're going to do that is kind of what I touched on earlier, that we're actually asking you to signal some approval for some of these ideas before we do the solicitation, so that the proposers will have a more clear and concrete proposal to respond to, because several of them did complain to us that the original solicitation was not clear and concrete, and that it was difficult to respond to for that reason. Does that
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for the
Hager.
most part, I guess when it gets down to the bottom line, I guess I have to look at the background of who the proposals are geared to and what experience they have doing this and what they've done in other cities. So I know we got a little bit further to go before we get to that point.
I think that those issues would all be considered in the evaluation criteria.
Okay.
And I feel really badly that Dan has come and not had to answer any really hard financial questions. So if anybody has a really difficult financial question, now's your time to jump in. And
It's by all means not necessary, though.
Just, I think the thing is show us the money, and that, okay. There's two action items we've been asked to consider. Is anyone willing to present a motion concerning these items? Yes, Ms. Woods.
Only one. Do you need two separate motions?
I think you could do it as one motion with two parts if you prefer. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I think you could do it as one motion in two parts if you prefer.
Okay. I move to approve the increase in parking meter rates by 25 cents. Do you want me to read the whole action needed?
Or however you want to structure your,
Exactly like the action recommended, 1 year, hour effective 1 year from date passing Traffic and Parking Commission with annual adjustments for CPI, Consumer Product Index. Motion one.
okay, is there a second on motion one? We have a first and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Okay, action item 2.
I'll make a motion that, with the caveat that there's a grace period in there, so of extending the metered parking areas of operation from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., at 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., so people know.
It was clarified.
6
It
a.m.,
is-
I'm sorry,
it is
6 a.m. to
beginning at
6
8 a.m.
p.m.
It's 8 a.m. till 6 p.m.
It would be expanded to 10
Oh,
p.m.
it's misstated. I thought this was.
Yes.
And that
I
is the
wasn't
one
reading.
where we were recommending that you make that prospective, effective July 1, and contingent on a parking deal with a bidder being consummated.
Well, I obviously had the hours wrong, so someone else want to make it correctly.
What,
8 to 10.
okay.
From 6 a.m.
No, there's a
8
mistake
a.m.
on the agenda. It's
Okay.
not 6,
Just
it's
take
8.
cataracts taken off. This is, I do not, you should be able to do this. From 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. to 10 p.m.
8 a.m. to
We're still on 8. Is that correct? Okay.
I'm telling you, 6 p.m. to
8.
8 a.m.
8 a.m. to 10.
someone else might want to do this. If you've got it written down, go, Councilman.
Okay. Councilmember Hager, can you structure our motion, please?
As I understand, it's 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. and then 6 a.m.
It is
to
8.
10
Look,
p.m.
it's right up here.
8 a.m.
Now you tell me.
All right, 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. Sorry.
Okay.
Now
All
we got
right.
it.
So there's a motion to extend the parking hours to 10 p.m.
Second.
Okay.
And could we make that so it would be contingent and prospective?
Okay. Mr. Hager, can you modify the motion to satisfy legal counsel, please?
The motion is to amend from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. to 10 p.m.
Contingent.
Contingent.
And I'm sorry, it's not in the agenda item, but what we were talking about is making it prospective to an effective date of July 1, 2019, and
Correct.
also making it contingent on Metro successfully consummating a deal with a parking vendor, because we don't want to,
Right.
assuming, which we all hope won't happen, things don't work out, the
Right.
current parking enforcement patrol may not want to enforce the
So we'd
additional
be amending it to a prospective date of July the 1st of next year, correct?
2019, is that correct?
No, of this year, 2019.
2019, and also contingent on us approving for the private contractor and the RFP process.
Okay. All right. So we have a motion. Is there a second?
Second.
We have a second. All in favor? Any opposed? Okay. All right. There are a set of conceptual items here relating to implementing metered parking fees on Sunday. Citations for violations and increased parking violations at $25. Free metered parking for clean vehicles to go away. To allow aspects of the enforcement to be outsourced to a vendor. I think we discussed that consistent with state law. Need to allow management of valet parking to be outsourced to a vendor subject to jurisdiction of the commission. We would amend the Metropolitan Code needed to allow management of the residential permit parking process, allow management of loading and unloading zones. I think all the items we've discussed here today, and metered, and that we would keep metered zone expansion. So I'd ask for a motion to approve these conceptual concepts.
Yeah, and if I can just clarify, the reason we're calling it conceptual like that is all of these changes require changes to the Metropolitan Code by council by ordinance, and they will be mandatory referrals to this commission when that legislation is actually drafted and filed. So it will come before you again at that time. But just to assist us in negotiations with prospective vendors, it would be helpful if you would, as Brian said, kind of signal your positive approval of us making these changes.
Okay.
Question, has council sent this to us and we're sending it back? No.
No.
Not yet. We don't have legislation filed and pending with Metropolitan Council as yet. We anticipate having that soon. So you all, this is kind of your subject matter jurisdiction, maybe more than any other body in Metro. So it seems like having your recommendation and concept maybe carries more weight than any other one would.
All right. So is there a motion on these 8 conceptual items?
I'll make a motion.
Okay. Ms. Kern has made a motion. Is there a second? We have a first and a second. All in favor? Aye. Aye. Okay. Any opposed? Okay. All right. Are there, Ms. Costonis, are there any other items we need to consider? Okay. All right.
No.
Mr. Durbin, I appreciate you coming, being in the wings. I know you did not get called, but appreciate your support. Mr. Kelsey, thank you very much. I also just want to express my gratitude for you being regularly available to members of this commission to discuss this idea and concept. So.
Are we supposed to say anything about North Carolina?
I'm not aware of that, but I think that would probably be a good idea to adjourn then.
I'll make the motion to adjourn.
Okay, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
This has been a service of the Metro Nashville Network. If you would like to see this presentation again, or for more information about this and other programs, visit nashville.gov.